we'd gone, Linda and I had gone to see this movie called Heaven's Herds, which I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's a beautiful movie. It's about Nguni cattle, and it's set in KwaZulu-Natal, and there's all this evocative filming of silhouettes of the horns at dawn, and it's all amazing. And we came out of the supermarket, came out of the movie and went to a supermarket and I just saw this whole stack of polony. And it just came to me then that spectrum was just a fantastic way of telling a story about South Africa. And my initial idea was to write a book about South Africa for Brits. I wanted to publish it in the UK, and I thought that would be a way to do it. And then I started mentioning it to people, including when I was at NALMA, and inevitably people would say, oh, you've got to go see my cousin who lives in Port Alfred because he's doing this, or, oh, there's this other person, and it just built momentum. It never wrong-footed. It was always substantial, and the book later reoriented to being for South Africans and published in South Africa. And I guess I felt it was a way of, after 25 years in the country, of telling a story about the place. It's kind of like a critique and a love letter.
How many of you have actually read the book, just to get a sense? So some of you. All right. So to give you a bit of a sense of what journey Greg has been on, it really has, when I read it, which was sporadically over the last month, finishing off in a cave with my son reading the last chapter to me as I made supper in the Co-Boekenveld, which seemed fitting. It's a real journey through time, and what I really loved about your journey, Greg, is, as we all know, you're an investigative journalist, and I felt that whatever you were putting on paper was taking me along your investigation. I felt like I was part of that investigation. It was kind of a game of tennis between information. And I pictured you standing literally like a herder, and you were herding information. You get a sense of one cow going off in that direction, you would go and get it. And you'd bring it back and you'd weave it into the story. And you would get a sense of grazing was over there, so you need to go take them there. Anyway, there was a real herding of information that I picked up in the narrative. So maybe there's a discussion that's my observation anyway. To what extent were you inviting the reader to really be part of that investigation with you?
Well, it's great that you got that out of it, actually, because that's how the book was written. It was like that. I was following the story as I realized that for my living, I write about politics and business and the connections between them. That's good. And occasionally I get to throw in a bit of anthropology, but rarely. And this was just this fabulous opportunity to write about the whole lot, to be able to look at history, at politics, at culture, at the science of it, because that was the bit I didn't know. When I started off writing the book, as I said, it was about South Africa. And then, because the thing took so long, the whole narrative out there about climate crisis and the contribution of industrial livestock to that was getting louder and louder. And I just thought, well, I can't just write a book and stay in what is relatively my comfort zone. So I plunged into the science of it to try and see if it was all still legit, I would say, or whether it was just the game was up. So yeah, I did go on a journey, and I physically went on a journey around the country, and up into Swaziland and into Namibia over the course of the decade, and realizing actually the story could have One could have gone up into Zimbabwe, Botswana, there's a whole story. There's whole bits of South Africa I never got to. So it's kind of like, I guess it's like the beginning of it. There's actually so much out there. It's a huge thing. And I really just hardly touched it.
So the first part of the book is a short, sharp, inquisitive look at African history, Southern African history specifically. And the only bit that I can remember from my school days, because I'm in apartheid school days, I remember, the only bit that I remember was Nonkwause and her dream. And her dream that essentially, if you slaughter all your cattle, the white man will be marched briskly into the sea with the help of ancestral warriors that will come down. And I think what for me, just that brief little stab into history was that there was. I'm just aware that what I learned as a young guy was wholly insufficient in terms of the narrative around African culture. Never mind the connection to cattle. And so I really appreciated that. Just the other colourful bits, which were crucial bits in understanding why one would remove a food source, quite a serious food source, from your platter, so to speak.
Yeah, the history, I mean, on that Bose, I first learned about it from Linda's grandmother, who had quite a standard line on her, which was that she lied. It might have been true, but it wasn't. And I took that as being, that was the point of view I was replicating for a long time into the writing process. But then I discovered this historian called Helen Bradford. I don't know if anyone's read her, but she is fantastic. She writes this feminist history about South Africa and showed how it was a kind of setup. That everyone was putting all the blame on this sort of teenage girl. And there was this whole backdrop to it, patriarchy and violent patriarchy. I thought, God, I got this story completely wrong. So I then tried to learn more about it and understand where she was coming from and what the how other prophets had come to this and what was the connection with all this lung sickness was there, and all this kind of stuff. And just realizing, I mean, the cattle intertwine into the human history of this country in lots of different ways. Like the way, one of the features of South Africa compared to the rest of the continent is the extreme prevalence of fencing. There's nowhere in the continent that's got as much fencing as South Africa. And I went into it a bit about the history of fencing and how it started off trying to stop rinderpest, and once they got in the habit of parceling things out and controlling them with it, how that process accelerated. So, yeah, there was much more to cover, but I'm glad to put a new twist on that story.
You then march into present day, context, and you take us on this wonderful journey through the hills of KwaZulu-Natal, and we meet these three families and their different relationships to their cattle, and I wonder if you would have received the same reception had you not been walking in through the door with Lindy, being a Brit and all, you know.
Well, absolutely not. No way. It wasn't going to happen. No, that was teamwork. That was full-on teamwork. We travelled around together doing this, and it was great doing it together. Because I was English and therefore knew nothing, I was able to ask anything. And Linda could translate with a well, you know, it's him asking. That was great. I mean, there was one I remember where we came to one of the families, and there were two women herding who'd just come back from herding cattle, and their that's it's meant to be. Their husband, the husband of the man of the house, was in Johannesburg, so it was a household where women were looking after cattle, but still having to consult with men by cell phone about what to do about if something came up. So it was this sort of curious working out of patriarchy. But anyway, I asked the question. I said, you know, there's an expression in English, stupid cow. And what do you think? And and Linda translated it, and you can see it, and what? Like, and one of them said, well, I don't know, cow feeds us, gives us milk, resolves disputes, sorts out dowry. How stupid is that? So, fair enough. But I asked the same question with another woman from another household, who her response was that cattle quite often don't listen to you and go off and quite stubborn. But that's because they're cattle, and that when people do it, they're like stupid cattle. So in that sense, you could see that it was kind of okay. Anyway, but I wouldn't have got any of that without Linda Way. There would be no way of it happening. And we were also with an old family friend who was introducing us to these families and just welcoming us to their homes and talking pretty frankly about their lives with cattle. I mean, that I should say was one of the most pleasurable things about doing this. Is in my normal work as a journalist, I'm usually asking people who just don't want to talk about it. You know, it's about diamonds, or it's about corruption, or something that's sort of hidden. Or just that this person put me in the job and then I've got to do this and these obligations. I often look at things like that. And one of the joys of this book was that there was none of that. Everyone was just so happy, if not proud, to talk. Even people you wouldn't expect to be like an abattoir owner. Like in the US, animal rights activists have to resort to these devious methods to get in and film these abattoirs. And this guy was like, no, come have a look. He was pretty proud. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that you certainly allude to in your writing is our lack of connectivity to the food world and how things end up on our plate. Never mind something with a heartbeat. So yeah, I really appreciated that. Yeah, I wouldn't have found it easy walking into an abattoir and watching all that. I wouldn't, even though I'm a meat eater. I'm a bit. So I appreciate the depth of the investigation, where you had to go to for that. You move out of those KwaZulu-Natal hills and do head straight into the sort of the production side of beef and beef stroke dairy. And there were some fascinating little bits for me. One of them, I think it's in the dairy trade. In essence, we forget that it's a global market out there, and that includes anything with a heartbeat, or certainly something that can have a heartbeat. So this idea of being able to clean out the inside of a uterus in the dairy industry, you wash it out, you harvest those eggs. You harvest the embryos. I don't know why I thought you harvested the eggs. The eggs then went over to the States. They get fertilized and then get deep frozen and sent back. Is that incorrect?
Yeah, when it was explained to me, I got a bit confused as well. It was in Namibia. I found a farmer who was doing this, and yeah, they farm embryos, and because there's all these restrictions on the transport of livestock. So they bring over these embryos in test tubes and then implant them into receiver cattle. There's this whole science of it. In fact, the president has done it. Cyril Ramaphosa was given some Ankole cattle by Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda. But there was no way, with all the phytosanitary rules, you could actually bring those cattle into South Africa. So they didn't want to have any scandal about that. So he got the embryos and then brought them over and put them into receiver cows, and they gave birth. And then he's got a herd of several hundred head of Ankole now. So yeah, it gets what it was weird, and it alludes in the title to the Wanted Dead and Alive, is that in these industrial processes, you're not even really farming the cattle. You're like farming their uteri, or you're farming their rumen when it comes to milk. You're not, the cattle is just the carrier of this other thing you're farming. And it's very detached and very commodified. And in stark contrast to these farms in KZN, where the cattle are literally part of the family. And that's another spectrum that we traverse in this country.
And that alludes to what you were talking about before we started this evening, was that your journey with cattle, in essence, the cattle is this vector for all these other stories. It's a vector that brings us, right up to today, where we grapple with land reform and how we as a society in South Africa really put our land to its best use. And certainly it's clear from your investigations that there's only a certain amount of that land that is available for sustainable cattle farming. To me it was we can't continue the way we're going. The vector we're on as a species in terms of our requirements for meat can't continue in the way they are. Clear message.
Yeah, I spent like all the decade thinking, how am I going to end this book? What is my conclusion? How does this end? And I just did not know. I was just getting all this information. Was it this? Was it this? And curiously, it's been actually since the book's been published, and I looked back on it and thought about it more. It sort of distilled a bit about where I kind of got to, which, roughly speaking, was that it seems that in South Africa, most farming land is not suitable for crops, and that it's about, the figures I've read, it's about 80% of farmland is only really suitable for one form of grazing or another. So that's our context. Another thing that I came to understand is that back in the day, South Africa was filled with hooved animals that wandered all over the place, and as they moved about, kept the soil healthy. And the combination of shooting nearly all of them and putting up lots of fences has completely screwed that up. And South African soil is not in good shape. But if you really want to finish it off, get rid of all the remaining hooves. So, for the sake of the soil, you've got to have some hooves there. And that means, vegans, that if you have that, in a kind of, at some point they're going to be slaughtered. Now, it might not be after 18 months, as in the industrial model. It might be after a long life, as in the rural African model. But at some point, nobody's keeping cattle to keep them alive forever. So there's that. So what I came to is there should be cattle, but just not many, because the methane issue is real. Cattle produce methane, although apparently if you feed them seaweed, they produce much less. This one needs to be followed up. I only found this out towards the end, but that seems kind of a potential game changer. Anyway, cattle produce methane, and methane's cooking the planet. So it's that balance between keeping the soil alive, which in the jargon they call carbon sequestration, locking carbon into the soil against the methane, and then so it should just be a lot less, which means that when we eat cattle, we should eat them much more rarely, and we should eat the whole lot, and preferably it should be in some ceremonial and celebratory form, which takes me back to these families in KZN, because that's exactly how they consume.
It's something we also spoke about before we started this evening, was what I really appreciate about your look at this story was that you're able to present a statement and then shoot off to the guy next door and just corroborate that statement and come back again and question again. And what I really enjoyed was the drilling down. And I think we, as we move forward, when we hear arguments for and against something, it's critical to move away from the argument and come in at right angles to something. Because if we're left in the kind of coal versus nukes debate, one forgets about all the other little add-ons, and we remain, as you said, in these silos of research or these silos of discussion that don't present a full picture. And this idea of our cattle or our livestock, our essentially creatures we're sharing the planet with in many cases, they take on these. Certainly, from a rural perspective, you refer to these creatures as walking banks, walking fridges, and walking. There was another one. I wrote it down here somewhere. What did I say? Yeah, they're a walking bank, church, and fridge, basically. And when they take on that meaning, by the time it arrives on your plate, it has a whole another context that adds in a whole new weight to your meal, and it also means at the end of the day, certainly for me, that when I choose to eat meat, I can choose it to be a special occasion, and choose it to be something that is indeed an honor. And I think that's another layer of your story.
I mean, I tentatively made these conclusions knowing full well that the world crashes on. No one's paying any attention to what, really, I might say or not, the consumer trends will blast on. So I wrote it in that kind of knowledge that just putting it out there. But yeah, when I went into the cultural aspects around cattle and the ancestral aspects of my parents-in-law and my family, it went to a depth which completely staggered me, and I never really got to the bottom of it. I doubt I ever will. But so I've gone as far as I've been able to go, but so far. But I sort of came to the idea that you can have reverence, or you can change your relationship to cattle or livestock without having to have the full ancestral component. There is a sort of case for it in terms of just how we live our lives and how we treat the precious gifts that are available to us. When we got married and we slaughtered a cow for the ceremony, I really had no idea what I was getting into.
Does anyone have a pair of readers I can borrow for a second? Sorry, I'm destitute. Okay. It's okay, Kylie. It's good.
There's a Scarborough.
There's a Scarborough.
This is one pair of readers in Scarborough. It just has to be in the right place.
There's a library of readers. God, I'm sort of short. Yeah, sort of. Thank you. What we'll do is we'll keep the conversation a little bit longer, then we'll open it up to the floor for a few questions. Yeah? My work is kind of mentoring to some degree, mentoring of small business, and you at some point in time you're in conversation with Mahajana, and I'll just read a little snippet here. He says, I asked if Mahajana's children were interested in farming.
This guy's a farmer. He got a farm through land reform, and it's a big old 1820 settlers farm, and he's on it, and he's trying to make it work, and he's realised he's got to get bank loans. Anyway, so this is when I asked him.
He laughed. He said, his son, he said, wanted to do music and film. So was it worth it, is the question. He nodded his head. Look, in the past I had a dream. Today, I have achieved the reality behind my dream. It is not the same as the dream, but it is a reality. That is what liberation has been for me. A chance to live my reality, not my dreams. And that really struck a chord for me. It took me right out of my whitey Eurocentric space, and because I'm able to live my reality, and I just fully appreciate what it must be like not to be able to do that. Yeah, so simply put. And then there was another little moment, a little gem. Which I hope I can find now. Oh wait, no, I think I might have lost it. Oh dear. It's gone. It's gone. It's in the book. It's in the book. I've left you hanging. I think, yeah. Just for me, it just brought home the need for us to really tackle the land question and fully understand how we unlock capacity to work anywhere. How do we unlock capacity? And the statement, if I remember it correctly, it was a statement made by the Dr. Farmer person in Namibia, and she's referring to. Oh, I had the thread and it's gone. She's referring to. Do you know where I'm going with this?
No.
Wonderful. She's referring to, oh, there we go. She makes a statement. She says, this is less about cattle farming and more about how, essentially how we listen and how we give information and how we receive information. That line.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I'm with you.
Right. And that, for me, was another real gem. I think our abilities to unlock is really around our abilities to receive and give information.
Yeah, just finally, I mean, there was one of the unexpected things about the book was how fascinating the whole story around cattle and people in Namibia was, and how many lessons there are actually from the Namibian experience in South Africa. In South Africa, people tend to fixate on Zimbabwe, but actually, in terms of history, it's been much closer to Namibia. And some of the things that go on. So I went to meet some of these mentors who are basically white farmers who are now trying to train people above the so-called red line, which was imposed originally to stop the spread of rinderpest and basically separates the communal areas of the different category of yeah, that meat from there is not allowed to be it has all these restrictions on its export. But anyway, it's communal farmers who want their cattle alive. And these mentors are going up and trying to get them to be commercial cattle farmers who want their cattle dead. And it's difficult. And it's a conversation. And then when you talk to the mentors, they said they've come to realize that they thought initially they'd just gone to teach. And in fact, it was just a process for them. That whole thing was what it was about. And I think there's lots of things we can get from our daily experience here.
So Greg, thank you for going on that journey. From all of us to you. Thank you.